Have you ever walked into a room and immediately thought, I do not belong here? Because that's exactly how I felt walking into my very first parkour class. But somehow I kept going. And what happened next? Well, let's just say it wasn't pretty, but it was life changing. So last week, I shared the story of how I spent an entire year psyching myself up to start parkour. And on January 6, 2014, just a month shy of my 44th birthday, I finally did it. Today I'm sharing the story of that very first class. The nerves, the exhaustion, the moments I nearly gave up, and the sore muscles, and somehow the tiny spark that kept me coming back. Spoiler alert, it wasn't because I was good at parkour. If you've ever tried something new and felt completely out of place, or if you've ever been terrified of being the worst one in the room, then you might recognize some of what I felt that day. So let's go back to that Monday night class and relive what it's like to be the least athletic person in the room. So walking into that gym felt like walking into a party where you don't know anyone and everyone seems way cooler than you. They were stretching like they knew what they were doing and chatting casually. And then there was me standing off to the side, clutching my water bottle. This was a beginner class, but let me tell you, the warm up alone felt like a workout in and of itself. It wasn't anything too extreme, but it was a lot for me at the time. Now, after the warm up nearly finished me off, the instructor introduced our first move, the underbar. Now, if you don't know what an underbar is, let me paint you a picture. You're supposed to run and jump, throw your feet under a bar, then grab the bar midair with your hands and gracefully swing yourself through the gap. So graceful wasn't going to happen, and my friend and I took one look at that setup and silently agreed, we are not jumping feet first and trusting our hands to grab the bar. So we did what most beginners do. We grabbed the bar first and then jumped our feet through. And just to add a little flair, this wasn't happening on flat ground. We had to run up a ramp, cross an elevated platform, and then do the underbar and drop about 3 feet to the ground on the other side. And I remember thinking, okay, this feels doable. It's awkward a little bit, but doable. But we didn't just do it once or twice. We did it over and over and over again in rapid succession. There was barely a few seconds to breathe in between each turn. My arms were starting to burn and my legs were tired from running up that ramp over and over. And I kept telling myself, come on, you can do this. It's just a beginner's class. But halfway through, something clicked, or rather, something didn't click. I started watching the other students more closely, and they weren't struggling like my friend and I were. Their movements were smoother, faster, and confident. And I didn't realize until much later that this wasn't actually a beginner's class. I mean, it was that was what the schedule said. But I would come to find out that all the other people in that class had been training there for years. They were in this class because it was for adults, not because there were beginners. And the instructor had planned his lesson for this group of people who showed up every week. It wasn't that they were trying to make us feel out of place. In fact, everyone was very nice and super supportive, but let's just say it wasn't exactly the introduction to parkour I had imagined. So after what felt like a very short break, the instructor introduced our next move, the Kong vault. Now, first of all, a Kong vault is definitely not a beginner vault. You're supposed to run up, jump, plant your hands on a vault, and then launch your entire body over it, feet never touching the obstacle. It's called a Kong vault because you leap like a gorilla, arms stretched out, and your body soaring forward. The power and momentum carries you up and over, and everyone else made it look ridiculously easy. So I gave it a shot. I ran up, jumped, I planted my hands on the vault, and nothing happened. Nothing happened. So there I was, arms locked, feet dangling, I looked at the instructor, silently begging for guidance, and he just said, just climb up and over. So I tried to climb up and over, which looked less like a graceful maneuver and more like someone trying to wrestle a kitchen counter. Eventually, I made it over, but not without twisting my ankle in the process. Not enough to sprain it, but enough that every step for the next 10 minutes came with an internal monologue of regret. But there wasn't really time to dwell on that because the instructor, clearly sensing that things weren't quite challenging enough, decided to combine our two obstacles. So he set up the underbar obstacle right in front of the Kong vault. So now the plan was to run up the ramp, do the underbar, and immediately follow that with a Kong vault, or clamber awkwardly up and over the vault, as it was my case. So at this point, I was moving purely on stubbornness and adrenaline, and I was starting to wonder if anyone would notice if I just quietly left. But then finally, we moved on to something called precisions. And so you stand on one narrow surface and jump with both feet and land perfectly on another narrow surface. The instructor set up two balance beams about 6 feet apart and told us to just jump from one beam to the other and stick the landing. For my friend and me, well, let's just say the instructor made a very wise decision. Clearly recognizing by now we were actually beginners, he put tape on the floor to mark our landing zone instead of having us jump to one of the beams. Not that I would have made a 6-foot broad jump at the time anyway. And I can't lie, I was very relieved. I was a little embarrassed, but I was mostly relieved. Now, at this point in the class, I was completely drained. My arms were jelly, my legs were shaking, and my brain was running on stubbornness and pure pride. You see, my pride wasn't doing me any favors that day. I felt like I had something to prove, not just to the others in class that I thought were silently judging me, but to myself. I didn't want to be that middle-aged lady who couldn't keep up. And I didn't want anyone, especially myself, thinking I was too old, too weak, or too out of shape to be there. So I kept going. I kept jumping, even though every muscle in my body was screaming, please stop. Even though I knew I was one jump away from rolling an ankle or twisting a knee. My friend, on the other hand, was much smarter than me. She knew her limits and decided to sit out the last bit of class. But me, no. I was locked into a battle with my own pride, and I wasn't backing down. By the time the class finally ended, I was shaking, my legs were trembling, and I could barely walk to the car. The week after that first class was hands down one of the most painful weeks of my entire life. Every single muscle in my body throbbed. Walking up or down the stairs was torture. I couldn't even lift my arms over my head. Washing my hair was such an ordeal that I had to physically lift one arm with the other just to lather the shampoo. Even brushing my teeth was a struggle, and I'm pretty sure those underbars sprained my arms. To top it all off, I had a headache that lingered for 3 straight days. Clearly, neither my mind nor my body was prepared for that level of intensity, and I started wondering if parkour was a terrible idea. But thankfully, my friend suggested we try a class with Rick, her son's instructor that we had originally planned on taking a class with. So the next Sunday, we showed up for Rick's class to give it another go. It was an all ages class, which meant it was mostly kids, between the ages of probably 7 and 12. There may have been one other adult there. But this class was exactly what we needed. The vaults were lower, the pace was slower, and the expectations were much more reasonable. It was actually a beginner's class. And Rick, he was incredible. He was encouraging, patient, and most importantly, he knew how to break things down into smaller steps. If we couldn't do something yet, he'd say, that's okay, try this instead. He made parkour feel possible, and he made us feel seen and like we belonged there. I later found out that our first instructor was actually pretty introverted, which I can relate to. He was also a pretty big guy and looked a little intimidating. Not exactly the best vibe for two nervous beginners. But Rick, he was approachable and calm and clearly experienced at teaching all skill levels. We ended up training with Rick for the next 6 months. And by the end of that time, I finally felt strong enough and confident enough to try the adult class again with the same instructor. And, he turned out to be one of my all time favorite instructors. I made tremendous progress in his class, but only when I was ready for them. For the first 3 months, I went to class once a week. I learned to pace myself, to take breaks when I needed them, and to listen to my body instead of pushing through the exhaustion. Most weeks I stopped participating before the class was over. By the time we reached the free time at the end, we'd get like 5 minutes at the end where everybody could practice whatever they wanted. I was usually way too tired to even think about trying something extra. But then one day, after a few months, Rick called for free time, and I turned to my friend and I said, I think I feel like doing more. It seems so small, just a tiny moment, but for me, it was a turning point that I will absolutely never forget. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving class, I actually wanted to keep going. I could feel myself getting stronger, moving with more confidence, and building endurance. And week by week, those little improvements, they stacked up. Each tiny improvement was another signal to me that I could keep getting better. And the better I got, the more fun I had. After about 3 months, I started going to class twice a week, then 3 times a week. And finally, I went back to the adult class, the one that had felt so impossible on day one. The more I went, the more progress I made. And somewhere along the way, I realized I'd found something really special. Not just a workout and not just a hobby, but something that challenged me and changed me and showed me what I was capable of when I didn't give up. Thank you so much for watching. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt inspired to try something new, or maybe you're standing on the edge of something scary right now, please drop it in the comments. I'd love to hear about it. And if you're curious to see where this journey goes next, please consider subscribing. I'll be sharing more stories from my parkour journey, some practical tips for beginners, and more confessions about the missteps, meltdowns, and the magic moments along the way. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you in the next video.